Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J and welcome to my review of Satisfactory. Factory automation games aren't something I typically play, not out of disinterest, but because they have a reputation for being all-consuming entities. Starting from a simple premise that you have resources out in the world and need to find ways to efficiently get them from one place to the next, while also trying to process them into more useful components, there's always something to do, which leads the subgenre to be very addicting. The reason I made an exception for Satisfactory was twofold. To start off, it uses a first-person perspective, which means you're approaching the game very differently from something like Factorio. Second, it's a game by Coffee Stain, a studio dating back to the Steam indie boom in the early 2010s. Back then, it was much harder to get onto Steam, which meant anyone who could get there was basically guaranteed success, with Coffee Stain standing out for a first-person tower defense game called Sanctum. Since then, they've done quite well for themselves, between getting lucky enough to go viral with Goat Simulator, while also starting a publishing arm for games you've never heard of, like Deep Rock Galactic. Their main dev studio has been working on Satisfactory for a few years now, with it sitting in early access since 2019, a fact which meant I didn't know it was an Epic Game Store exclusive before I bought it, which I normally stay away from. Still, it was early access, so there's my excuse for the exception, and since it only recently entered 1.0, let's see if it was worth the wait. So, to get to the game itself, you are an employee of your typical, totally not suspicious corporation called Fix-It. You begin by getting a brief presentation of your objective to quote save the day and are dropped down to an alien planet, where you're told to get your butt working getting a manufacturing scheme going, with the aim of fully building out what the game calls Project Assembly, but is more easily remembered as stuff you put into a space elevator. As you work through the process of building it out, you gain access to new technologies to both make your life easier and to raise the complexity of the process required to get new components built. What makes the game work so well is that it does a good job of balancing the addition of new components without it being overwhelming. There's no procedural generation, and each starting point is merely a different spot on the same map. There may be some lost replayability from this, but it also means the difficulty curve is a lot more consistent regardless of your starting point, and the map is big enough that, unless you're achievement hunting, you can easily stay in the same general region for most of the game. You know that whichever one you start out at, you'll have a bevy of iron deposits nearby, a little bit of copper and limestone to get you going after that, and will only have to venture further out once you have to go hunting for future materials like coal and sulfur. To best demonstrate how this can get complicated and interesting in a hurry, we can focus just on the components that rely on iron. When you're starting out, pretty much anything you can put into a machine can be crafted by hand, and at the early stages usually is. First, you end up needing to craft iron ore into iron ingots, which form the baseline of a lot of early components. From there, separate constructors can be made for iron plates and iron rods, which will be needed to reach certain milestones and may be used to make basic stuff like foundations for more permanent setups. At least once you also get concrete production going from limestone, but that's beside the point. But then things get a little more complicated, as you might notice that if you have an iron smelter feeding into an iron rod constructor, that you'll technically be producing more ingots than the constructor needs. So maybe you want to build an extra constructor and can have both those constructors merge back together towards the same crates for easier storage. But then you notice that you need iron rods as the basis for screws, which you'll need a lot of for other manufactured goods, so you set that up as well. Eventually you find out that there's an assembler that can take in two resources, and the first component you can make with it is a reinforced iron plate, which requires screws and regular iron plates. And you always seem to have one or another as a bottleneck, so good luck producing enough resources to where you don't have to worry about that. And then you find out those reinforced iron plates are needed to produce modular frames, which also requires some of those iron rods you've been funneling into screws, so now you gotta split your focus a little bit there as well. All while this is going on, you're having to worry about powering all of this, as your power poles and the connections between them require copper wire and cables in varying amounts. And there isn't even a good one-to-one because a copper wire constructor feeding a cable constructor won't leave any spare wire. So you gotta have at least two copper wire constructors or a splitter so you have some left for both. And while you were figuring out those details, your power generators ran out of fuel again. So you need to go run around gathering leaves and whatever random sticks you can find on the ground so you can start your biofuel burners back up. In case you can't tell, there is always something more to be done, to where it scratches the just one more level itch you'd get from a good dungeon crawler. Always something that can be made more efficient, always an addition that can be made to add in more resources, always something to rearrange to make it easier to understand what's going on. In fact, given how much there is to iron out, literally, it's arguably a bad thing. because the game does attempt to get you away from the factory and exploring the wider world. Sometimes this is spurred on by the need to retrieve resources that are farther away, but there are also a few resources for which there's only a select few in the world, 2 of which contribute to giving a power boost to a producer, a 3rd that can help ensure you always have the resources you need on hand, and a 4th that grants alternative recipes for components, such as allowing you to create screws directly from iron ingots and therefore skip the iron rod step. Beyond that, with how varied the landscape is, there's a lot of neat views to be had, as well as a nice mix of creatures wandering around, some of which are hostile. And thankfully, they make sure that the danger a particular creature poses is proportional to the resources they're close to. So you won't have to contend with the super dangerous spider-like creatures that leave behind poison clouds right out the gate, they just throw the smaller ones that like to swarm around your legs at you instead, and can more easily be fended off with your starting shock rod. And more importantly, the 4 hostile creature types are all dangerous for different reasons, so even if the weapons are pretty simple, there's just enough variety in how you deal with them to be interesting. This is especially the case since the penalty for dying is losing everything in your inventory and having to trek back to where you died, which often means contending with the beasties all over again, so you are eventually forced to get good against them. But even though there's all that to see to, there was always so much that could be done back at base that I only ever engaged in exploration when I was waiting for a particular piece to be done for project assembly or needed to scout out some more resources. Speaking of those upgrades, the way they're introduced gives you a decent amount of flexibility in how you wish to tackle them. Besides the project assembly parts, once you finish a construction phase, you're given access to a set of milestones, with these ranging from improved conveyor belts to new resources to scan for. In keeping with what we just discussed, about the complexity slowly ratcheting up, they do a good job at introducing new things at a pace where you aren't wholly overwhelmed by it all. Before they introduce you to oil deposits and refineries, they introduce you to coal, which is used for both steel production and acts as the first power source that requires 0 manual input. Since the coal power plants also require water, that gives you some experience at handling liquids before you're having to manage oil refineries and their byproducts. You also have a separate system for research tasks, which to an extent are always available, though are usually soft-locked based on whatever resources you have available. These range from useful tools like improved weapons and an improvement to your sprint speed and jump height, to components that can help improve your factory, such as a splitter that can be selective about what goes in a specific direction, or a means to store resources to where you can retrieve them from anywhere. Stored materials can't be used for milestones or research, as much as the UI might lead you to believe otherwise, but it also means that if you've got a particular resource you always want on hand, you can have a bit of your production pipeline diverged to handle that. A fact which proved rather useful for conveyor belts given how often you need to put down more. To ensure that setting all of this up doesn't become cumbersome, there are a lot of ways in which you can customize your factory, in order to best make use of the space. Not every means is intuitive to figure out on its own, but even basic things such as raising the height of your conveyor belts can make a major difference, as then you can run conveyor belts over each other and branch them out when needed. The exact means to raise them without the stackable conveyor belt object took me until I was producing aluminum to realize, as you first have to confirm the starting position and direction before determining the height, but proved useful in order to juggle all the resources required for a particular component. As another useful option, once you get far enough along, you can make blueprints of common setups that you can plop down and have everything built for you in short order, without having to worry about everything being perfectly placed. I didn't find myself using them, as there were usually enough eccentricities from the terrain and the specific direction of raw resources to throw a wrench in the gears, but it may have been useful to exploit when I needed to start turning every oil deposit I could find into a power station, just to fuel the final production tier. And in case all else fails, the benefit of this game being 3D is that whenever you can't build out, build up. My main factory was a multi-level monstrosity from which parts were filtered in from a few different directions and eventually branched out into 2 layers above those. After that got more complicated than I was prepared to deal with, I first set up a resource dump for the spares above that, which ended up being a means to buy me time to figure out how to recreate something similar on a winding loop off to the side of level 3. The whole idea was to force basically everything onto a common pathway, from which it could then be filtered into the required component producers using the smart splitters, with some complications here and there when I needed to deal with nitrogen gas or water. Eventually even that was abandoned when I needed more space for the final production tier though, since it was easier to transport some of the higher tier components over to another set of mineral deposits than it was to get those resources over to the main loop. Perhaps if I hadn't been stubborn and committed to rebuilding and reorganizing a substantial portion of it, it wouldn't have gotten so messy, but hey, it got me to the credits, so no complaints here. And just in case you thought this game couldn't get any better, it has a co-op mode. I haven't spent a whole lot of time with it, but there are a couple of guys in my D&D group who own the game, and it was nice to bring out once or twice if we weren't prepared for the night. It does mean you have to coordinate with other people, but it ended up being a fun time as we divided up the work. The first session, it was just 2 of us, and since the other guy likes the exploration part, he was happy to go do that while I stayed behind and worked on building out the space elevator, which was naturally placed over an oasis on the sandy desert spawn because where else am I gonna put it? Somewhere normal? Once a third guy could join us, we switched to the rocky desert spawn, where we got lucky enough to earn that iron ingot to screws recipe I mentioned earlier, which simplified iron production considerably, even if it still ended up a major mess because iron is a lot more complicated than copper and limestone production, and having multiple hands in it naturally made that problem worse. It also meant there was some hilarity when one guy started attempting to reorganize the biofuel burners I had haphazardly set up, because he found that he was still using them a lot later than I did, and wanted them more organized since we were going to hang on to them even after unlocking coal. Fortunately, I could annoy him back by dumping resources into a milestone we arguably didn't need, because if he's gonna be OCD about something as temporary as biofuel burners, I'm gonna be OCD about milestones, damn it. Just be mindful of where you close out the game, as I had to improvise when setting up another copper production center because of where someone parked his worker. So yeah, the game is pretty neat, and a lot of my complaints end up being nitpicks. The world building is a little light, but since you're here primarily for the gameplay component, it's not something that needs to be hugely in-depth, and can still be funny at times.
Cluster Nobelisk unlocked. This type of Nobelisk detonates into multiple smaller explosions. Can be used for clearing large areas of vegetation and other inconveniences. Addendum. Inconveniences, in this case is not defined to include persistent family members, raccoons, student debt, the sunrise, peer performance reviews, neighbors learning to play the saxophone, phone calls, or your favorite show getting cancelled.
There's also not a lot of survival elements, apart from the creatures who will try and make you into a midnight snack, but since having to go scavenge for food would distract from the core gameplay loop, it's not something you necessarily want to include. Along with that, a few of the research and milestone unlocks are things I didn't bother with, such as bounce pads or land vehicle transport, but that was partially due to how I preferred to transport materials more generally, namely by setting up lengthy conveyor belt chains because having a bunch of them crisscrossing every which way was hilarious to me, if I couldn't justify using drones for a particular section. Also, if you wish to treat this as a chill experience, good luck trying to make this game work with a controller or undocked Steam Deck, because with how many hotkeys the game has, and with there being more than one point where you can type stuff out for the sake of looking things up in a codex or adding labels, you'd have to completely overhaul the UI to make it compatible with a controller. You would unironically be better off playing an old-school CRPG with a controller than this game, given that it was sometimes easier to type out a part name rather than sift through menus. Fortunately, I suspect that would be the only issue for the Steam Deck, as it ran fairly well on my PC, even after making the switch to Linux. Before that switch, it was using a little over half of my GPU, and only struggled to maintain consistent FPS when I was thrashing my processor with another task. In Linux, the only extra eccentricity I encountered was some weird physics when the autosave kicked in, but that's more a result of my work partition getting a bit scuffed, to where a different flavor of the OS on the same computer had little issue after Vulkan shaders were fully set up. And before someone tech-savvy asks for more info, I've been using Ubuntu Studio for my main OS, and straight Ubuntu to see how normie-friendly Linux has become for gaming. More on that in a future video. Beyond that, I did run into a few bugs, very few of which were game-breaking. One of them was a visual glitch near the start, which I was able to circumvent by just restarting the game. There were also occasional times where there was some strange visual bugs while traveling, which didn't impede gameplay but was peculiar nonetheless. Also, there were a couple of times either I or an enemy monster clipped through the terrain, which I was able to navigate out of relatively easily in the former, and used to avoid a tough fight in the latter. Another bug respawned one of the limited use resources after an update, which did make things easier for finishing out the research tree on my main save, but was otherwise harmless. Those concerns aside, what's present here is an excellent game that absolutely earned the attention it received on launch. There's always something new to find, something that you can make that much more efficient, more resources to funnel into the assembly line, or a whole new one to be built, and all in all, it's a really great time. It ended up being a 150-hour obsession that completely destroyed my attempt to focus on long-term projects last year due to how addicting it was, and it's gonna feel weird not having that nagging feeling in the back of my mind of what I want to improve when I get home from work. 10 out of 10 would get horrifically addicted on behalf of my totally ethical corporate overlords again. Yeah, this game knows exactly what it is. Should I be ashamed that I saw it occur at the 4-hour mark a few times, or just treat it as a testament to a solid core gameplay loop? Regardless, that will be all for this video, so thank you all for watching. Now that this has been seen to, it's back to the editing dungeon for me, to wrap up some of those long-term projects. One of them is nearly done, funnily enough, but this game soaking up anywhere from 2 to 5 hours of my day tends to make it difficult to see to much else. The fact that it got its fangs from me to that extent is a testament to how good it is, but I'd better be careful the next time I let one of these onto my computer. Until then, thank you all once again for watching, and I'll see you all later.